This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. If you've seen our show before, then you know we're no strangers to explanatory journalism that really seeks to put us in the deep end of a range of topics, from pretty frivolous things to third rails of American politics like abortion. A key point in debates about abortion restrictions is this question over when, legally speaking, we should consider life begins. Some anti-abortion activists may suggest that after this point, abortion should no longer be legal. Many prominent anti-abortion voices have asserted life begins at conception and argue this is clearly backed by science.
I personally believe that life does begin at conception. That's the standard that most Republicans who have held the presidency in modern times have held as well.
For consensus, that's your faith. That's your faith. That's not science.
No, it isn't.
It is not
That's
definitive science.
Absolutely,
I will have
it is.
scientists on this show all morning.
Is.
Biologically, life begins at conception. That's irrefutable from a biological standpoint.
But there isn't that kind of consensus, scientifically or theologically. Scientific advancement has only made the question way more complicated, and a number of experts in religious ethics have pointed out there's as much disagreement and change as ever, even within a single religion. Just ask Margaret Kalmitska, who's been researching and teaching religious studies and gender for over 20 years.
So the question of when life begins has always meant different things in different cultures and times. So it begins when the fetus gets its soul. Everyone agreed on that. But there was no agreement about the timing, and that's where the issue is.
So let's take a look at some of the theories for when life begins, some backed by science and some by faith. Because as the country braces for a wave of legal battles over abortion restrictions, it's worth questioning some of these assumptions we're going to keep hearing about what's really irrefutable here. First, let's roll back the clock, all the way back to the end of medieval Europe. Yeah, really. Back then, personhood was believed to start with the quickening, which was the first time a pregnant person felt a baby kick. That's usually around a little over 4 months into the pregnancy. Legal texts and midwife manuals pointed to that motion as a sign of personhood. Even the Catholic Church at this time didn't recognize abortion before the quickening as murder.
So the only passage in the Bible that talks about a fetus in any detail is in the book of Exodus, chapter 21. If the fetus dies, then the perpetrator pays a fine. If the woman also dies as a result of the injury, then the penalty is for homicide. So the early church knew, of course, of this passage and accepted the principle that there is a difference in legal status between a non-viable fetus and a pregnant woman.
But over the 19th and 20th centuries, scientific advancement taught us more about embryonic development, and the debate began to shift. It wouldn't be until as late as 1869 before the Catholic Church permanently declared all abortion to be a sin, which is its official stance today. Does that sound like a consensus? Well, not so fast. Contrary to popular belief, new research didn't actually bring us an irrefutable answer. Instead, the question got much more complicated. Part of that is because we now know many stages of development that have been argued to be when life begins. Time for a Biology 101 refresher. First, of course, there's conception and fertilization. Some Christians point to certain Bible passages that imply this is when ensoulment happens. One can also point out that the embryo now has full genetic material, but it's hard to say if that's biological proof of life. Most cells in our body also have that, and those aren't considered a separate life. 2 weeks later, we get to gastrulation. Now the embryo is biologically unique, so it can't become twins or triplets. One could also argue this is the start of an individual. At about 6 weeks, an ultrasound can detect a flutter of electrical impulses in the area that eventually controls a heartbeat. This is why proponents of abortion bans after 6 weeks call those laws heartbeat bills. But as many in the medical community have noted, the name can be misleading since the heart isn't yet fully formed. Ask a neuroscientist when life begins, and they could point to about 6 months in, when we can start to see brainwave patterns. When we lose these brainwaves, a person is declared legally dead in the US and in many other countries. So some could argue brainwaves signal when a fetus starts being a person. And around this time, the fetus can become viable outside the womb. That's another legal milestone. In Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court found the Constitution doesn't let states ban abortions before this point. Keep in mind, the point of viability is flexible, since it depends on what sort of clinical resources are available and how medicine has advanced. And now, of course, roughly 14 weeks in, we get to the birth itself. The Jewish faith, along with some Christians, see this first breath as the beginning of life and will point to other passages in the Bible to support this. You can see why we just don't have biological proof or even religious consensus when it comes to when life begins. And I'm not here to tell y'all any of these interpretations are more valid than the other. That's above my pay grade.
The Roman Catholic Church does not specify when life begins. They say there's a presumption it's possible, and therefore we should never do an abortion, a direct abortion. But the Roman Catholic Church understands that even modern science cannot answer that question.
As our understanding of these issues has changed over time, so too have our laws around abortion and our feelings toward them. I'm not just talking about old shifts from Anglo-Saxon legal texts or 19th century Catholic decrees. Like, take the invention of the ultrasound, which was widely adopted in US hospitals in the 1970s. Without the ultrasound, we wouldn't even know about that little flutter that's become the basis for the many so-called heartbeat bills we've seen get passed through state legislatures in the last 3 years. The question of when life begins is always at the heart of these political battles. So it's important to understand why that answer is so impossible to agree on. There seems to be only one thing that's actually certain. The answer, as with life itself, is never so simple. We've showed how many biological arguments on this topic can vary. Now let's take a second to talk about what some major religions have to say on this. As we said up top, it's not as clear-cut as you might assume. Whether we're looking at major religions using the same texts or we're looking at a single sect of one religion, there's a huge range of theological debates out there. And to help break down some of this for us, we're joined by Newsy correspondent Amber Strong, who's been reporting on religion and family issues for years and has been following updates around abortion access in America. Amber, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell me a little bit about how abortion is formally viewed within the different sects of Christianity, not just Catholicism? And my question to you, is it as universal as it might seem?
So that is a giant no. The first disclaimer that I want to throw out there is that religions all across the board are not a monolith, right? Even within denominations, you're going to find different interpretations of Holy Scripture. So when we look at Christianity, there is a large portion of Christians who are okay with abortion, who say that the Bible explicitly does not say thou shalt not commit abortion. With that being said, you look at groups like Catholics, white evangelicals, many Black Protestants, Mormons, and they're going to tell you that you need to read between the lines.
I want to expand this out a little bit, Amber. What about other major Abrahamic religions like Islam, Judaism? What are the other approaches to abortion?
When it comes to, we'll start with Judaism, there's a little bit more consensus. About 83% of American Jews are pro-abortion rights. And that is based on this notion that the fetus is an extension of the mother, that the fetus has the potential for life, but ultimately the life of the mother should be protected. And that idea that the life of the mother should be protected extends to Islam as well. But with Islam, we do see certain stipulations, and that comes down to something known as ensoulment. But there isn't a consensus over when that happens. It could be at conception all the way to 120 days. And because there is no consensus, you see different schools of thought, and those different schools of thought are very much seen across Muslim majority countries.
You know, when we do this job, sometimes it's about, really kind of clarifying a topic. Other times it's about really showing people how complicated a topic is, as we've seen here. But we appreciate your expertise here, Newsy national correspondent Amber Strong. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely.